All right, I'm gonna up where I left off. Previously, we had talked about the history of measurement in the early 10th century. Let me go find that. Here we go. In the early 10th century, there was huge progress in terms of King Richard's standardization and the definitions of some of the modern units today. Hundreds, the metric system was in it, put into place. A man who had a huge part in that was John Wilkins. He actually didn't live to see its commencement, but he had some of the first ideas that were then used during the late 1700s when it was put into place. So John Wilkins actually wrote a pretty document in which part of that, a very small part, was used to describe the need for a universal measurement system for length, weight, capacity, and money. So he wanted a standard unit of length and a universal on Earth. And he was also in favor of using a decimal base 10 system that would allow the users to divide large units or multiply small units simply. His idea was to base that standard unit of length on our Earth because to be for the people. And so he decided that the meter was to be created 1/10 millionth of the distance between the North was the distance of a meter, and that was actually solved using trigonometry. 1790 to be exact. The United Kingdom and the US were trying to develop a decimal metric system internationally. Thomas Jefferson was heavily involved in this and had access to John Wilkins' book because so Thomas Jefferson's idea went like this. Let this length therefore be, let 1/10 of it be called a foot, 1/10 of a foot, 1/10 of an inch a line, and so upward. It should be a perch, 10 perches a furlong, 10 furlongs a mile. And similarly, John Wilkins described using different names and units, but he said, let the foot be divided into 10 inches, the inch into 10 lines, and the line into 10 points. Let 10 feet make a decad, 10 decades, 10 roos a furlong, and 10 furlongs a mile. So some of the units were different. But regardless, Thomas Jefferson Wilkins, and so people believe that Thomas Jefferson did read his paper. The map to in the lower left-hand corner actually shows the world in 1971 and who was committed to the metric system and who was metric or after World War II. And then the white countries were uncommitted at this point. They did not commit to the use of the metric system. So interestingly, the rest of the world had made the transition to the metric system. The US was still uncommitted in 1971. Though I think it should be noted some of our founding fathers, I do believe it was Ben Franklin included, and Thomas Jefferson, they were so involved in the creation of the metric system. And then the country, of course, hundreds of years later, was still uncommitted to the design they were so readily interested to create. So that's an interesting part. My curricular materials, I focused on grade level 5. Basically, the students are focusing on measurement units used in historical societies. I would want them to understand that there was many fluctuations in the magnitudes of unit measurements that frequently occurred over time. Within one society, actually, one country, you could have one unit that changed in size. And mostly the fluctuation occurred, the discrepancy occurred between different countries in terms of they would use the same unit names, but the sizes would be different. And so I want students to be aware of that. I also, since the 5th grade standard for measurement largely deals with conversion, I wanted the students to be able to apply their knowledge of conversions to the different measurement systems. Another thing that I really want the students to be able to do is to describe with significant historical detail the various countries' experience of the metric system and be able to reflect on its use. I actually thought about part of it would be students writing like a persuasive paper trying to convince the leaders of our country to adopt the metric system. And they could even refer to some of the other systems and their kind of inconveniences. I'll just pull up my curricular materials really quickly to give you all a little bit of a feel. So there's quite a few different parts in this one grade 5 unit, And so the first part deals with the Egyptian and Babylonian biblical units. I actually found an awesome book, and I linked the video here. It's called How Tall, How Short, How Far Away. And though it's a second grade reading level, but I was really excited about it because it refers to the history of measurement. It talks about Egyptian measurement and also how the metric system was derived. And so this author does a really nice job linking measurement to its historical roots. So that the unit would start by students reading that, and then it would kind of come back to that in the end. But anyway, the first lesson would involve the Egyptians, and students would talk about the cubit, and they would look at this artifact. They would be engaged in converting between Egyptian units, biblical units, between amongst themselves and between the ancient units and today's units. And so following that, they would study Rome, and part of that would involve students kind of guessing how far they think that they could walk in 2,000 steps, because that was Rome's main standard for longer distances. And so students would start by kind of making conjectures about how they could figure out how long they could walk in 2,000 steps without actually having to take 2,000 steps. And so using a ratio might be effective there, and then multiplying to get the product of that and 2,000. And so involving them in this might be interesting. And then it would also speak to the fact that one person's length of their stride would be different from another, and how this wasn't a very standard approach to measurement, and so forth. And then my next focus is the English periods of time in the early 10th century. Students would focus on making a standard chart for the different relations between the inches and the perches and the rods and so forth, and they would also create a bar model that would show the relationship. Students would look into King Henry I's definition of a yard and see whether or not there was discrepancy between their own personal bodily yard, their parents' bodily yard, and King Henry's. And then there's also some great kind of challenging word problems to follow that involve conversions. Following that, students would kind of engage in a little bit of like a mock kind of a play kind of format to talk about the inconveniences and the challenges that having different sized units, or the name one unit's name for different sizes would result in local disputes. And so students would focus on what would this look like if people were using different units in terms of construction, what would it look like in trading, what would it look like in buying and selling land. And so students will discuss how the need for a standardized approach was necessary. And so that would go along with the huge development in the 1197 where King Richard standardized the yard. Lastly, within this historical period, students would focus on the definitions of area in terms of the furlong, acre, oxgang, virgate, and caricate. And so they would actually look up some of the kind of the I guess the cultural uses of farming within this time, just to learn a little bit about why every unit would come back to farming with ox. And so after that, students would engage in some tough problems involving conversions. Lastly, students will look at the start of the metric system, and there is this great video provided by Twig Carolina, and it kind of recaps the history of measurement in Egypt, and it also talks about how the metric system was started. Students can also look into John Wilkins' essay. I linked a really awesome translation done, so it's more approachable in that way. Teachers would probably have to locate that small chunk of space within that essay that was devoted to the description of the metric system. But I think it would be worth it to engage in the study of that primary source. And so in that way, it has social studies curricular ties. Students will also kind of do a little bit of research, investigate the life of John Wilkins, and then also in order to link the idea that the meter was 1/10,000,000th of the length between the North Pole and the equator, students would try to conceptualize what 1/10,000,000th is. And so using base 10 blocks and teacher constructed base 10 blocks, students would be able to do that and talk about just how small it is. Students would also look at, kind of like my presentation described, Thomas Jefferson's and John Wilkins' first ideas and kind of reflect on how they're actually different from the metric system that we know today and do a little bit of writing on that. And so that's kind of how it would work. It would be chronological, and I envisioned teachers coming back to a timeline used in the class and marking off the time periods. But the main focus is to introduce the students to the units of these societies, talk about, real life relevant issues and that were associated with measurement systems that were unstandardized, and then talking about the importance of standardization and what that looked like. And so students will be able to engage with difficult, challenging problems with conversions along the way, while also developing an appreciation for how challenging it was to develop a standardized form of measurement. One thing that I realized, and this is kind of similar to my project on negative numbers, in which it was so diverse across different countries and so diverse across time. It was really challenging to find information about historical measurement units because the same name was often used across different societies. And so if you're defining what a rod is, you would absolutely need to know what year you were talking about and in what country, because it's so specific to that time and who was using it. Because like I mentioned, one name was used for many different magnitudes. And so there's a lot of complex factors that contributed to changes over time as well. And so it was very challenging to find reliable sources that were able to separate by time and by society and country. As I realized, I started to think that my goal would be for teachers to have access to kind of a source of accurate information about significant periods of time within history, because there is a lot. And one of the most helpful resources I used was actually pretty lengthy and not so accessible for a teacher who already has so much on her plate. And so I wanted to include mostly the information about the historical periods, and then with accompanying ideas on how to make them come alive within the classroom. But some of that I did leave to the teacher in terms of creating word problems. As you saw, I did create some, but my main goal was to give teachers a place to find information. What I've learned is that the evolution of linear measurement is complex. It was ever changing and it was very diverse. I learned that unstandardized systems created complications in allowing different communities and people to communicate. And so standardization was critical in the development of developing societies. And I didn't realize that there was beauty behind the origin of the metric system, and that beauty was very based in nature and our Earth. So although it was a challenging project, I did come out with some really important understandings. And so we're excited. Thanks for watching.